من الشقتين سنة مثل الكوفية كيف ما لبستوني وين ما شلحتوني بضلني ع أصولي فلسطينية من هيك لبسنا الكوفية لأننا وطنية الكوفية كوفية عربي من هيك لبسنا الكوفية هويتنا الأساسية الكوفية كوفية عربي يلا علي الكوفية علولي هالكوفية الكوفية كوفية عربي علو هلا بلاد الشام كوفية عربية بتضل عربية كوفية عربية كوفية عربية كوفية عربية كوفية عربية من هيك لبسنا الكوفية لأننا وطنية الكوفية كوفية عربي من هيك لبسنا الكوفية هويتنا الأساسية الكوفية كوفية عربي يلا علي الكوفية علولي هالكوفية الكوفية كوفية عربي علو هلا بلاد الشام كوفية عربية بتضل عربية.
Some of y'all think it's a trend, a fashion statement. Disgustingly, I spit on the pavement. It's basic. Y'all know I bang for my flag. My bandana ain't no rag. The keffiyeh ain't no scarf. It's a part of the movement. The symbolism is resistance. No coincidence that you can see the RBG in it. Que bonita bandera. Ain't it beautiful? I say it in Spanish. It's solidarity. The feelings is mutual. Meanwhile, high, that's M1 in Arabic. I'm pro-Palestine, does that make me a terrorist? You can catch me in Gaza, in Haifa or Ramallah, but I'm still just Mutulu Olubala. So when I rep with Shaja, we rhyme with our middle fingers up to the Zionists, cause we don't give a fuck, it's justice. So tie that thing around your head and ride, wave it in the air and let me know what side you on. Uhuru, yeah. The keffiyeh is Arab. Yeah, it's M1. Solidarity, feel me, Shaja. Do it. From the ghetto to Gaza, I keep it RBG up. Yeah. Bang for my flag.
Tú nos dices que debemos sentarnos, pero las ideas solo pueden levantarnos, caminar, recorrer, no rendirse ni retroceder, ver, aprender como esponja, absorber. Nadie sobre todos, faltan todos, suman todos para todos, todo para nosotros. Soñamos en grande que se caiga el imperio, lo gritamos algo, no queda más remedio. Esto no es utopía, es alegre rebeldía del baile de los que sobran de la danza tuya y mía. Levantarnos para decir ya basta. Ni África ni América Latina se suba. Con barro, con casco, con lápiz a patear el fiasco. Provocar un social terremoto en este charco.
الرضع صار الوضع بده الردع لكل السيد بتحرر مستوطن بتلمد لكن مصافحة يد ألفان ألف الرق بالهدار اللي عندنا سلاح مطيب فبركوت أما لما ألمي يدي نرجع الواقع كما todos los callados todos los omitidos todos los invisibles todos
igual mapo. 1000 veces venceremos, del cielo al suelo y del suelo al cielo vamos. Caballito blanco, vuelve pa' tu pueblo, no te tenemos miedo, tenemos vida y fuego. Fuego en nuestras manos, fuego en nuestros ojos, tenemos tanta vida y esta fuerza color rojo. La niña María no quiere tu castigo, se va a liberar con el suelo palestino. Somos africanos, latinoamericanos, somos este sur y juntamos nuestras manos. Todos los callados, todos los sometidos, todos los invisibles, todos los callados, todos los sometidos, todos los invisibles,
Hi, y'all. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. I'm so excited to see this many people in one Zoom room. It's kind of wild. My name is Nico. I'm here with the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition. And yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody for making the time to be here, and also for anyone who is planning on being in person for pivoting and meeting us here online. I know the snow has kind of quickly melted away with the intensity of the sun, but we just wanted to be on the cautious side of things. So yeah, thank you all for coming. And I also wanted to, even though we're not physically there right now, give a thanks to the Friends Meeting House for being willing to host us today. And then also we'll be doing the event in 2 weeks there, also hybrid. And so, yeah, just a thank you to them. So a little bit of housekeeping really quickly. We are recording this event, and the recording is currently going. So just wanted to give you all a heads up. If that means you want to turn your cameras off or anything like that, that is happening. And since we're on Zoom, just if we can all stay on mute unless we're specifically speaking to the group. And I also personally love seeing people's faces in virtual events. I feel like as a presenter, if you don't see people's reactions to what you're saying, it can feel like you're just like speaking to a void. So if it feels like you can turn your cameras on, it's just like a sweet thing for us to make this virtual event feel a little bit cozier. And so, yeah, this event is being hosted by the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition. So just to give y'all a little bit of background around us, we've had, several different iterations over the years. But in the last year or so, we've been very focused on political education and approaching the topics that we discuss through specifically anti-imperialist frameworks. And so groups that historically have been involved in this coalition have been the All African People's Revolutionary Party, Showing Up for Racial Justice, Global Action Alliance, Red Ant Collective is newly involved, which has been exciting. And in the past, some themes that we've touched on in our political education have been Cuba, also nuclear colonialism in New Mexico that Leona has done a lot of work around. We've also had comrades come to present on their land defense and internationalist approaches to standing in solidarity with people defending land all across the world. And so now we are putting on this series to continue with these sort of anti-imperialist frameworks and to hopefully educate a little bit and also foster curiosity around groups that, get labeled as terrorists. And we want to unpack that label a little bit in this series. And so on the flyer, we have 2 dates, but it'll actually be a series of 3 different presentations. So today we're specifically focusing more on the Houthis, and then in 2 weeks we'll be focusing on Hamas. And then the third date hasn't been decided. It'll probably be around March 9th or something like that. We'll be posting on social media and also sending it to the email list once we've decided. But in early March, that presentation will be focused on Hezbollah. And so, yeah, today we're hoping, to learn a lot from our presenters who have done a lot of research to try and, impart some information to y'all. But we're also hoping to have this feel like a collaborative space and be able to learn from each other. And so, yeah, there will be part near the end of breakout groups where we have discussion questions and that kind of stuff, but hopefully just spaces of engagement where we can kind of unpack a little bit of what we're learning together. And so also if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to drop those in the chat. And those can also be up for discussion in the breakout rooms and that kind of stuff. And if you're having any technical issues, you can either direct message me or Yusti, who's in the hot pink hat right now. Really easy to identify you. That was smart. And yeah, I think that's it for the intro. So now I'll pass it to our presenters. We're going to have Keegan from Anti-War Coalition and from Red Ant Collective doing the presentation for today.
So thank you so much for that intro, Nico. Are we able to pull up the slides? Lovely, lovely. What's up, y'all? It's great. I'm very grateful to be here with everybody. A little sad that some of us can't be in person, given what Nico said about rapidly melting snow. But yeah, very grateful to be here with y'all. A couple of things we wanted to mention just before we get into kind of the meat of the presentation is that, could we go to the next slide, please? We're on day 127 of Israel's kind of current iteration of their really, horrific assault on Gaza. And there aren't many words for it. There are not many silver linings to things like this, but one of them is that I think people around the world are galvanized, and I know that that's one of the reasons that we're in this room is that the Houthis have taken a particular kind of stand, which we'll talk about, and that's one of the reasons why we're in this room together discussing it, and that's awesome. Another thing to note is that neither or I are experts on Yemen or the Houthis or the Middle East. We did a lot of research over the past, 2 weeks to a month, and are doing our best to present what we feel is like a accurate characterization based on what we understand. Like any part of the world, it is an incredibly complex, dynamic organism with like a whole historical context that trying to digest very quickly was not possible. So we're also open to being wrong. And yeah, I just wanted to make that note that we're not experts. We're doing our best to present information that we received. Also, in the chat, Kobe just shared an informational packet that will kind of be a companion to this presentation and also hopefully be a thing that you can use to do your research on your own, essentially, or with other friends and comrades or people in your community. On the first page, there's both the link to a link tree and also a QR code to that link tree that has itself a link to a list of resources. That's a Google document that's kind of like a master list of resources about this series, the kind of understanding the axis of resistance. And in there, you'll find a lot of the articles and things that we digested to try and come up with the presentation and the packet that you'll see. Awesome. I'm going to have a sip of water and then we're going to get started with the presentation. Could we go to the next slide, please, Nico? Dope. Cool. So the brief kind of agenda is that we'll have a couple of introductory questions as a large group. I think that questions, if you want to either throw your answers in the chat or if you want to come off mute for a second and say a quick answer, that'll be awesome. And then now we're going to give a kind of, like I said, a historical and presentation on the Houthis, and it's talking about Yemen and the region in general, which will be followed by some space for questions that might come up in the chat or come up after that presentation. And then we'll have some sort of small group activities. We'll go into breakout rooms. And then we'll come back to kind of close things out together, and we will dream about eating Frito pie that would have been at the Quaker Meeting House, but is now just going to be living again in our dreams. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it to my comrade.
Hey, can you go to the next slide? Hi. Just one thing I wanted to touch on. I am part of the Red Ant Collective. I'm also part of Sammy Dune. And I hope there will be a link to the Instagrams. Yep, there's a link to the Instagrams handles, both of those in the chat below. But so to start off, and this is put your answers in the chat, but we're trying to get a sense of like what you guys think about this stuff right now. So who can you put the answers to the following questions in the chat? Who are the Houthis? Where are the Houthis? And what have you heard or read about them?
Also, like, if you want to come off mute really quick and be like, oh, I think they are this, or they're from this, you're welcome to do that too. Don't be too shy. Yeah, from Yemen. Rachel says, I've learned so much about solidarity from the Yemeni Houthis. Awesome. Supporting Palestinian freedom. Cruise ship terrorists from the news.
Cool music videos, nice resistance group, that's good.
Political foreign movement to end foreign control of Yemen. That's like a nice little encapsulation for sure.
Been bombed by the US, Saudi Arabia, and the UK. Yeah, it's important. All right, okay, cool. So, yeah, funded by Iran. Okay, yeah, so there's a lot of cool idea, a lot of interesting stuff going on in the chat. I think at this point we're going to continue on. So can you go to the next slide? Great. So now another question. Does anyone want to, or can you put in the chat anything that you noticed about Yemen's location? Right next to the strait. Yeah, that's really important. Coastal. Yeah. There's fishing as well as trading industries. Next to Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Okay, cool. So I'll cut it off there. But yeah, I think that you guys have mostly touched on the important things that I wanted to mention. Yemen, oh, I said the Red Sea, yeah. So one of the important things is that is Yemen's geography with respect to Saudi Arabia. It's bordering Saudi Arabia. They have a huge land border. They're next door neighbors. The other important place I wanted to point out, and whoever is sharing the screen, can you point out where Palestine is in Israel on this map? It's up above Egypt a little bit. Yeah, it's right there. So that's where Palestine is with regards to Yemen. And yeah, this the Strait of Bab al-Mandeb is a really important strait. That's the place in between Yemen and Djibouti, around Eritrea. That is an incredibly important strait for global shipping logistics. I think about 9% of all oil transported by tanker ships goes through that strait. Most things that go from China to Europe goes through that strait as well. If that strait is closed, you have to go all the way around the Horn of Africa to go from the east to the west. So that's a very strategically important location. All right, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to give a brief history of Yemen here. So everything used to be kind of the Ottoman Empire in this area. In 1918, the Ottoman Empire kind of started collapsing, and this area broke into North and South Yemen. And it's still, by the way, these general areas are still referred to as like Northern and Southern Yemen. And that's an important divide for reasons we'll get into later. But yeah, the north was like actually Yemen. The south was controlled by the British. In 1932, Saudi Arabia becomes a state. In 1934, the borders are still kind of a little bit loose. And so they decide to go ahead and annex some of Yemen's territories, which is shown in yellow on the map on the left. And then in 1962, the Yemen Arab Republic gets established, the YAR. And so that replaces the former imamate that was there after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And then in 1969, the South Yemenis kick out the British and establish the Democratic Republic of Yemen, or the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, the PDRY, which is very important. We're going to talk about the YAR and the PDRY later. The next slide. And then in the 1990s, oops, sorry, go back real quickly. Yes, so in 1990, the unification happened, and unification was very popular. Everybody wanted, people there consider Yemen to be kind of like one thing, generally speaking. All right, now next slide. So the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, PDRY, was a very interesting and very important time in history. This is the only Marxist-Leninist state to have existed in the Middle East. It was attacked from all sides. The YAR was trying to destabilize it. Saudi Arabia was trying to destabilize it and attacking it constantly. Any of Saudi Arabia's allies were helping them. Had very, very few allies. Despite this incredible, the other thing about Yemen to note is that it has very few natural resources, in particular fresh water. Has very little fresh water, no particularly productive mines, and at this time it also didn't have almost any exportable oil. Despite all of this, in the PDRY, they had free universal healthcare, free education. They nationalized a lot of stuff, which led to things like cheap rent. An academic in this area said the following, quote, "The PDRY managed to provide living standards for its population well beyond its financial means." So yeah, in addition, it did have some relationship with East Germany, the Soviet Union, and Cuba provided education for its medical schools for a little while until they bootstrapped that process. The next slide. So let's talk about the Saudi and UK US influence. Let's start with US and the UK first. I forgot where I read this, but somewhere said the US doesn't have a Yemen policy, it has a counterterrorism policy. And while not all encompassing, I think that framing is pretty solid. The US, it cares about counterterrorism, it cares about the strait, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, and it cares about its buddy Saudi Arabia. Insofar as those three things interact with Yemen, it will care about Yemen in that respect. Outside of that, it really doesn't give a shit. UK is pretty much the same. So that's the US and the UK. Saudi Arabia. to frame this next part, it's important to note that Saudi Arabia has a population that is about the same size, a little bit bigger, and it's growing faster than Saudi Arabia. The other thing is that Yemen has fought a bunch of wars in the past, and so one thing that one of the books that I read pointed out is that, or claimed rather, is that Yemen has a much more competent fighting force than Saudi Arabia does. It has a lot less money, so they can't field a lot of like fancy technology and jets and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes down to it, the soldiers are better, the generals are better, etc. So with that in mind, this quote I think really takes care of framing this. What Saudi Arabia feared primarily was not just an independent Yemen, but a socialist, anti-imperialist, united Yemen that would have the capacity and capability to enforce its will and its objectives on the region at large. So that's what Saudi Arabia really fears, and by extension, the U.S. and the UAE and etc. So they don't. Saudi Arabia traditionally, before 2015, did not bomb or in any other way invade Yemen. They instead sent a lot of money, and they did CIA shenanigans. They would assassinate people. They would fund this group, then that group, and whatever. One of the good examples is the Yemen Arab Republic, the YARs in North Yemen. At first, they were against it, and they funded all these opposition groups. Then when it won, they tried to co-opt the movement. They paid off people inside of it and whatever. Then when unification happened, the president at that time was Saleh, and we'll talk about him later. They were working with him, and then when they decided that he was no longer of use to them, they funded the Isla Party to oppose him and to co-opt the Arab Spring uprisings. So yeah, next slide.
Awesome, thanks for all that. So just to briefly recap, we've seen that Yemen essentially started after the end of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. We've seen that it had two states between the kind of 60s, and then with the South and the North, and then in 1990 it got unified. And as Chen mentioned, this was like really popular, the unification. Even though the YAR North Yemen and the PDRY South Yemen were like pretty different states and handled affairs pretty differently. And a character that is very important to this unification is someone who ruled Yemen for 33 years named Ali Abdullah Saleh. So he was the president of the Yemen Arab Republic, North Yemen, from 1978 to 1990. And then he ruled the unified Yemen from 1990 to 2011, and still was really influential, as we'll learn a little bit later, until he died in 2017. So like this guy was around for an incredibly long period of time. And the first thing to know about him is he was incredibly corrupt. He took money from different factions. He was constantly seeking to enrich himself. He died with a net worth of $30 billion spread across 19 different countries. So homie was like stuff in his pockets, was not particularly interested in the welfare of Yemenis, which became apparent over the 33 years of his rule, and eventually led to a lot of opposition to his regime. I think something else to note that Che kind of touched on is that like, though Yemen, not all of it was blessed with a lot of natural resources, until Saleh took over, a lot of Yemen was relatively self-sufficient. It grew a lot of its own food. It manufactured a lot of its own goods. It provided a lot of its own electricity. And one of the things that Saleh did when he took over is that he started to accept loans from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and other structural adjustment programs that changed the internal kind of dynamics of Yemen's economy to be from one that was very relatively self-reliant into one that became very dependent on foreign food and on foreign imports, which becomes very important, especially as we get into the 2000s. So in addition to being very corrupt, was very kind of brutal against people who spoke out against him, or for people who rose up against him in different ways. After unification in 1990, there was a period where in the South, what had been formerly the PDRY, the Socialist Party there felt like it was not being represented by national politics and made that vocally known. And so Saleh's regime led a really brutal crackdown and a war against those people. So we'll talk a little bit more about him, but he's just a very important character in what we'll see happening and in the beginning of the Houthi movement, which we'll talk about now. Can we go to the next slide, please? Lovely. Awesome. So we have this slide is titled Ansar Allah Beginnings, because the Houthi movement, which is what it's called by a lot of the Western media and a lot of Western academics, is actually a movement called Ansar Allah, and gets sort of shortened to the Houthis because they derive their initial movement from a group that's kind of like an extended family in the northmost province of Yemen, that province up there called Sada, which began as a non-violent religious movement in the early to mid 1990s. It was a religious movement that carried with it Yemen's sort of theological interpretation of Islam. And one of the reasons that it got popular is because it was responding to the Saudi Arabia's trying to essentially perform religious colonialism by spreading their own theological interpretation of Islam, which they weren't down with. The Yemenis were like, no, actually, we have our own. We're good. Thank you very much. They also were responding to, as I mentioned earlier, Saleh's regime was leading a pretty brutal crackdown of Southern socialist and other progressive elements in Yemen at the time, and they were very against that violence. And so they over the course of time, they became more and more popular in Yemen and gained a special popularity after the United States War on Terror began, and the Saleh regime essentially declared its intent to support the U.S. in its attack on Iraq, in its destruction of Afghanistan, and things like that, which most normal, regular Yemenis were super against. Because of that, and because they became very vocal critics and kind of like the leaders of a coalition of vocal critics against Saleh's policies, they were attacked. And so the Saleh regime led 6 wars against Ansar Allah from 2004 to 2011, the last of which was the bloodiest. And at some point during that time, I don't remember the name of the youth movement, the nonviolent religious movement that they had, but at some point before 2011, they rebranded and their name became Ansar Allah, which it still is today, which means God's fighters, God's partisans, or Saida is saying Allah means God in Arabic and Ansar means supporters. So it's like supporters of God is the translation. And a couple of things to note about their kind of political lines is that they were super against the corruption that they noticed, and that people were being fleeced by the Saleh regime. They're very against Western and Saudi influence in Yemen's affairs. We haven't mentioned it yet, but in addition to Saudi influence, both Qatar and the United Arab Emirates have also had designs on Yemen for some time. And they were also against those kind of foreign meddling influences. And I heard this in a podcast actually earlier today, and I just wanted to say it because it was a pretty, just a very concise way of describing this. They kind of embodied a political resistance to a process of an economic colonialism, which I described earlier when Saleh was kind of selling out Yemen's national economy to foreign countries, to the IMF, to the World Bank. And so they were also resistant of this idea as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, so Saleh's regime leads 6 wars against Ansar Allah and their supporters from 2004 to 2011. By the end of this, they've become a pretty effective fighting unit. They've fought 6 wars over a decade against a military that is sometimes supported by the most modern militaries in the world, and won. They continue to see Yemen's future being sold out to foreign influences like the United States, the UK, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf countries. And in 2014 they marched from Sada, there again, that northmost province in which they sort of originated, down to the capital of Yemen, which is Sana'a, kind of in the middle on the western part of this map, to depose Ali Abdullah Saleh's unelected successor. They were like, you are not elected, you are doing things, you are signing more deals with the IMF, you are compromising the future of our country in a way that does not allow us to have either sovereignty or economic or political independence. So no. And it's worth noting that they were kind of the leaders of a broad coalition that cut through theological lines, it cut through different political lines, it cut through other demographic lines, and they assumed essentially control of the government at the time. And kind of the goal was to keep Yemen a sovereign state, with independence and its own kind of political autonomy. Immediately, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, the US, and the UK all saw this as a threat to interests that they had in Yemen, and they lost very little time. I think this unelected successor, the president at the time, was a man named Mansour Hadi. He was arrested by Ansar Allah in late 2014, and by March 2015, a coalition comprised of Saudi Arabia, 2 other Gulf countries, and with a lot of support from the United States and the UK, starts a war on Yemen to dislodge this movement. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this was the first time that I had heard of Yemen, and I'm curious how if this is other people's experience as well. I remember hearing reports kind of every once in a while between 2015 and 2019 on NPR or something that there was a horrible famine or there was a cholera outbreak in Yemen, and I had very little context for it. But the context is kind of what we said, that a movement, Ansar Allah, the leader, kind of like these leaders of a big coalition, had tried to keep Yemen independent. That went up against foreign interests and what was called the internationally recognized government, and so a war started. And this war was really horrific. It was mostly pursued in the air, kind of like the way that we're seeing Gaza right now. It is mostly a bombing campaign against people in their houses and their villages. Infrastructure was targeted, similar to the way that Libya was initially targeted by NATO forces. Farms were destroyed, bridges were destroyed, water infrastructure was destroyed. And this led to, as I mentioned earlier, Yemen had become incredibly dependent on foreign food and other imports. And so the famine and displacement and disease in this period was like truly horrific. And yeah, a lot of people argue constituted genocide against the Yemeni people. It was not successful. Ansar Allah remains in the de facto power in what is kind of like the confines of historical North Yemen. And I think the Western press continues to frame it pretty reductively as a civil war. It is true that there were some Yemenis fighting other Yemenis, but the kind of interests are not the same. And this war would not have happened without other Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and the UK, essentially holding Saudi Arabia's hand through bombing a country for sort of through the present. But there was a brief ceasefire between 2022 and 2023. Awesome, and I'll pass it over to, that's not awesome, but I recapped that, and so I'm going to pass it over.
Okay, can you go to the next slide? So in the current moment, Ansar Allah governs about 80% of Yemen's population. In the map shown, it's the kind of the red part. It's not that much like land area, but that's where all the people live. The blue is the Isla Party, which is the Saudi-backed party, and then the yellow is the Southern Transition Council, which is a Southern separatist movement. And importantly, the Southern separatists do not have the same politics that the PDRY had. They're different, and they're, I think, backed by like the UAE. In the under the section of this map called Areas of Control, August 2023. It says ISLA, PLC, and allies. The PLC is the Presidential Leadership Council, which is a structure by which the Southern Transition Council and the ISLA party can work together against Ansar Allah, right? It's just like kind of pretty openly all of the foreign powers working against the anti-imperialist power. Next slide. So this part is pretty interesting. When we were first doing this, somebody, actually they're in attendance today, sent over something called the National Vision for the Modern Yemen State. And I initially looked at it and I was like, this is kind of boring. It's just like a whole bunch of like, we want like normal government stuff. And then it was pointed out to me, a lot of people don't consider Ansar Allah like a government. They consider it like, oh, like rebel fighters or, you know, whatever. And this national vision for the modern Yemen state published by Ansar Allah really, it's an 81-page document. It really kind of lays out like a whole bunch of normal government shit that Ansar Allah is trying to do, right? So for example, I pulled out a couple of points that they had here they have like 2 pages of these like icons and descriptions. But first one is increasing the participation rate of women in the labor force to 30% of the total labor force. Interestingly, the PDRY had 30% participation in the labor force back in the 80s, but yeah, so you know, this reducing inflation, generating building the generation capacity of 600 extra megawatts per year, increasing the number of units of housing available, reducing poverty, reducing corruption. All of these things are like stuff that any normal state should want to do. And so I think it's just important to point out how like much of a normal government Ansar Allah is. The other thing that I want to point out too is while I was trying to like read and learn about this and whatever, there's a big emphasis in most sources, especially Western sources, on emphasizing the religious aspects of this. Oh, it's a Shia movement. Oh, you know, it blah blah blah. And certain things stop making sense when you view it in that respect. And I found a much better way to conceptualize this is as just think about it as an anti-imperialist thing and think about its goals as very materialistic, like, you know, very material, very like what benefits people, right? Increasing participation in the workforce, reducing inflation, electricity, people need electricity, you know, people want their money to buy things, etc. Then there's a religious lens that goes over that whenever they express things generally to the outside world, when they have like press conferences and stuff, there's lots of couching things in terms of religion. So one way to kind of like think about that is to compare it to like, for example, the civil rights movement, where they were like, oh, we want, you know, equality. We want, you know, especially Martin Luther King. He had a whole bunch of stuff to say about poverty, about stopping the war in Vietnam and all that kind of stuff. But you know, it's organized in churches and there's a lot of religious language, and you know, hopefully one day God allows us to see that whatever, this kind of stuff. So I just want to point that out. Next slide.
Awesome. Thanks for all that. So this kind of brings us back to the present moment. We talked about the history. We've talked about kind of the way that an initial movement in the northern part of Yemen became what is now called Ansar Allah, which is often called the Houthis by, again, the Western press. And the reason that we're talking about all this is because they've demonstrated an incredible level of support for Palestine, which has come at incredible material cost to them in the form of them being now relentlessly bombed. Last time they were bombed was 3 a.m. last night by the United States and the United Kingdom. So the first thing to note about this is that the support in the form of preventing Israeli-linked shipping or ships bound for Israel or the United States or the United Kingdom through the Bab al-Mandab Strait, which leads to the Suez Canal. that has historical precedent. So there are a lot of media actors in the Western press who are saying, who will write articles and not even mention the fact that Ansar Allah is doing this in support of Palestine, or they'll say that, oh, Ansar Allah is doing this just because it makes them look good to their people, which it does, but it doesn't mention that actually Yemen has an incredibly long history of supporting Palestine. And so a couple examples are both both South Yemen and North Yemen, when they were separated between the 1960s and 1990, provided different kinds of support to Palestine over the years. In one case, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait was actually blocked during the October War in 1973, in Israel's October War. In the 1980s, the PDRY helped settle a bunch of kind of exiled Palestinian fighters, and helped settle a bunch of Palestinian civil society people who needed a place to live and practice, whether they were lawyers or doctors or whatever. And they've also been consistent. They've been consistently vocal, as we've mentioned. Yemen has not always. Yemen's GDP is not high. Yemen happens to be one of the poorest countries in the world, and so they have not always been able to support materially, but they've always been very vocally in support of the Palestinian people since before even Israel was created in 1948. And as the Western media is twisting to say that this is the only reason why they do this, that Palestine is an enormously popular position, supporting Palestine is an enormously popular position in Yemen, but it is, and I'm sure that helps solidify their position as the kind of legitimate, as they're making the case that they're the legitimate government. They govern 80% of the people. They're taking up the tasks that I mentioned earlier that are like the kind of the banal stuff that you do when you govern, like generating electricity and making sure there are enough housing units and things like that. And I guess just I want to mention, because we keep reading in media, oh, attacks, Houthi attacks, Houthi attacks, Houthi attacks. I'm not aware, and I could be wrong, but I'm not aware of anyone who's died and maybe not even been hurt by any of the kind of Houthi interception of or taking custody of ships. Just to know that, like, they keep saying attack, but it's more like like a blockade or something. There was, for example, a Hungarian crew that was, their ship was confiscated because it was bound with supplies to Israel, but that Hungarian crew is getting their, is not like in custody. They're just in a hotel somewhere in Sana'a waiting for flights to get back to their home country, just as an example. Okay, cool. Can we go to the next slide, please? And this sort of leads us back out, zooming out to like kind of what we're thinking with this series on the axis of resistance. This is like a series of, or kind of a friend group of nations, of movements who are demonized relentlessly by Western media. That it is very difficult to get even like a balanced picture of what these groups are, many of whom are in governmental positions. So like Ansar Allah is governing people, has been governing people for almost 10 years. Hamas is the government in Gaza. Hezbollah is part of the government in Lebanon. They have like political, educational arms. Which we're going to learn about all those things, right? Syria and Iran are literal states, nation states that do all those functions. They are not like faceless or even, kind of the caricatured people with Kalashnikovs and sandals that the United States media just relentlessly pushes upon us. That doesn't mean that like, people have commented on our Instagram and things that we're supporting terrorists and things like that. That doesn't mean that we agree with everything that any of these people have said necessarily, right? But we don't feel the need to even speak to that, right? We're just trying to have a conversation about movements that are being bombed literally like every day by the United States, in some cases for the last many years, or by their proxies. And some of the things that unite the axis of resistance are vehemently anti the United States and Western presence in the Middle East. In the packet that we shared on the first page is a map of the known U.S. military bases in the Middle East. And those are the known ones that are being reported, which is like there are dozens in this fairly compact geographical area, and maybe more. The United States has, I mean, over 800 confirmed military bases around the world. There is no country that has even close to that. They're also linked by an extreme dislike and disdain for the state of Israel, what they refer to as the Zionist entity. Yeah, get the US out of everywhere. Yeah, absolutely. And again, the media just gives us a really narrow picture of who these groups, who these countries are. And as we've seen with kind of revelations about the initial allegations about what happened on October 7th, the US is incredibly sophisticated at creating atrocity propaganda to make us hate these people. And it is on us as people who live in this country, whose some of our tax money is going right now to bombing people in Yemen, to at least understand who these people are that our government is claiming that we should all be against. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we just talked at you a fair amount. We would love if folks have questions to please come off mute, or if people have comments to share, if you'd like to throw a question or two in the chat. If there's any that we missed as we were talking, we would love to get back to that. But yeah, we just want to give a few minutes to have kind of, yeah, just a little bit of a review or any questions about what we talked about. One thing I want to touch on is someone in the chat, I think I made the claim that it was like Saudi pilots but US everything else, and I explained that a little bit in the chat, but for folks who may not have gotten to see, when we're talking about the war that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar led on Yemen from 2015 through 2022, and kind of now sneakily continuing, what I meant by that is that the United States technically didn't have to declare war because it didn't commit any of its pilots to bombing runs, but the planes were US made, the bombs were US made, the training of those Saudi pilots was provided by the United States Air Force. The military intelligence for targeting capacities and selecting targets was provided by the United States. So it's like a United States war in all but like the people happening to sit in the cockpit is what I meant by that.
I'm also seeing a question here. How much did Saudi Arabia spend on the war against Yemen? The last numbers I saw, which are not up to date, is around like $264 billion. And it's one of the thing about like really poor countries is it doesn't cost that much money to like upgrade their infrastructure and stuff. So I love this question because I looked up a lot of how much various things would cost. And so just here's like a little rundown of what you could do with part of if you had wanted to develop Yemen instead of bomb it. 1 million new housing units, according to something from the Queensland University prices of construction, would be $10 billion. 1 million new houses would be $10 billion. Enough infrastructure for 1.8 million people to get water that is desalinated, including the electricity, the solar panels for electricity and water treatment, would be another about $3 billion. 1 gigawatt of extra electricity would be another $1 billion, and 2 years of food would be $4 billion. So just throwing some numbers out there.
Yep.
We have two other questions. One from Lara. What is the range of opinion of Yemeni folks on Ansar Allah? And then another one that I think is related. how much of the Houthis' avoidance of Western financial obligation, equity, resource distribution, Congress from a Marxist or ML framework?
I'll speak to the first one a little bit. So the first question about what is the range of opinion of Yemeni folks? I've found that to be incredibly difficult to find, and I really wish that I spoke and read Arabic. I feel like it would be a lot easier to get a better sense of that if we were reading this in the language of the people that were there. Personally, what I'm getting from Western stuff in English is that it really varies. There's some people who are very fervently in favor, and some people who really don't like them. And beyond that, I don't think I can give anything that's informed. Did you have anything there, or anyone else?
Yeah, no, actually, me and Keegan talked about this, I think literally like 1 or 2 days ago, about how like, yeah, there isn't enough data that we can get access to really understand opinions on the ground so much.
Is there anyone else who happens to have expertise in this that might know or have a sense of that? Just curious. No worries if not. Cool. The other question about kind of how much of oh wait, sorry. That question
I think somebody deleted it.
Oh, cool. We're happy to speak to it. It was kind of about how much of the policy, kind of international policy of Ansar Allah comes from a Marxist framework. And that is also something that I honestly don't know. I read an article that I think was translated from Arabic, that some of the policies really resemble those of like some of the state socialist projects of the 20th century. This is an article about agricultural cooperatives and how land was being kind of expropriated back to being collectively held, particularly farmland. But that's kind of all that I can speak to that.
There's also a hand raised. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but Lizzie and Brian.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I was just on how popular they are. I think it's important to note, like when they took Sana'a, like when they came down from the north, like the only reason they were able to do that is because the army essentially like mutinied and like almost wholesale like went over to their side, like in opposition to like the internationally recognized government, and so they were like pretty popular amongst like the armed forces, and their armed forces today are essentially just like carbon copies of that. And so that kind of showed like a mass popularity, at least in like the armed forces, and lots of like the popular mobilizations on the streets also like were in support of them. And obviously that was like close to 10 years ago now. Yeah, so that's just all I had on that.
Yeah, one thing about that is the when they marched in and took Sana'a, they were actually in an alliance with Saleh at the time, which is partially why a lot of the armed forces were with them, because they were loyal to Saleh and then whatever. However, in going forward, that alliance ended and Saleh was assassinated in like 2018, I think. And like they still have, I believe, I don't think that changed their support from the military. So that's another piece. Oh, also to the how much of their avoidance of Western financial obligation and resource distribution is a Marxist or ML framework. Yeah, to kind of echo what Keegan said, they do have some like kind of PDRY inspired policies and stuff. It's unclear because there's currently like fighting a lot and they have some like really immediate stuff that they have to deal with. I think it's going to become more clear how much of that they how far in that direction they go after kind of the war settles down and they have ceasefire agreements and stuff like that.
The other thing I would briefly mention on that is that, again, the movement Ansar Allah, that is currently kind of the de facto government in North Yemen, is super there's a lot of variance in ideology in terms of some parts. Like there's a spokesperson who spoke with Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone, who's one of the spokespeople for Ansar Allah, who used to live in, I think, Denmark and was a member of the Socialist Party there. So there's probably a pretty broad, there might be a left wing, there might be a right wing. I imagine that is kind of being struggled within that group.
Actually, thanks for bringing that up. There's the in 2011 to 2014, 15, there was something called the National Dialogue Conference, where all the stakeholders in Yemen were brought to the table to talk about like how to like develop a new constitution and stuff like that. The representatives for Ansar Allah were rather leftist. They, however, were assassinated. But yeah, to Keegan's point, I do think that there's a broad spread. Also, you have guys, you can't keep deleting your questions. Sorry, there was a question. I don't remember what it was, but it just got deleted.
There was a question about the huge protests that we've seen that are being organized, pro-Palestine protests. And then someone else said that it's very broad and there are socialist leadership. There's also anti-communist leadership.
Yeah. To the Palestine thing. Yeah, people generally in the Middle East are, and people, not the governments, the people are extremely supportive of Palestine, and Yemen in particular. So yeah, they are all out for Palestine, 100%. Oh, and then the question about how much of the avoidance of international dependence comes from values in Islam. I don't think that much, to be honest. I think a lot of this is materially based, and though again, back to my earlier point, they'll express it oftentimes through a lens of Islam. But you know, I think that when you look at their coalitions, it's Shia, Sunni, it's atheist, it's whatever, as long as they agree on like some anti-imperialist stuff. I think it mainly comes from the anti-imperialist stuff because those international, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you all so much for a lot of questions and for sharing your knowledge in the chat and out loud. We want to do a little activity together in small groups. So if we can go to the next slide. We kind of have two options for this. One of them is an article analysis that I'm going to put the article in the chat. The article is also on page 6 or something of the packet. I don't remember exactly. It's an NPR article. And kind of the goal that we're gonna do in small groups is to, we've heard what kind of like I have had to say today, what we've shared, what the knowledge that we've shared together in the chat, and with sort of sharing questions and answers. And also we all bring a lot of knowledge, before that we met today. And so we're going to read an article together in small groups. And the kind of instructions are as follows. We want to read it, someone to read aloud a couple sentences or a paragraph, and just kind of discuss what's coming up, like for example, what narrative is being constructed, or maybe are there voices that are absent, or wow, that seems really at odds with something I just learned. And it doesn't have to be anything in particular, but we're just like hoping to do some critical reading of this NPR article together. I don't know, UC, are we ready to go into breakout rooms? All right, I think, does anyone have any questions about that before we do it? Okay, tight. I think then let's just jump into it. I'll see you on the other side of the tunnel. All right, y'all. Sorry to have yanked you perhaps in the middle of a really good discussion. Wanted to give, I don't know, Nico, if you're able to go to the next slide, that's great. And if not, no worries. But Yeah, does anyone want to, either in the chat, or it'd be awesome if you wanted to come off mute and just, were there any point or two that was raised in the discussion that was really important, questions that were raised that were hard to answer, anything that felt salient? Please feel free to share.
Well, I know in our group, we started talking and tried to find, we ended up trying to find countries that did not have a US base. And I'm not sure we came up with very many. So that was just kind of a little sidebar that happened in our discussion.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, go ahead, Saida.
In our group, we talked about how the words Iranian-backed were used in almost every paragraph. Iranian-backed proxies, Iranian-backed targets, Iranian-backed. We talked about how the death toll of the Americans, the 3 Americans, is named, but not how many Yemeni have been killed by the U.S. government. I mean, Obama was bombing Yemen back in like 2008. Talked about how there are quotes from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, the U.S. National Security Advisor, and a quote from Iran, but no quotes from Yemeni, no quotes from Ansar Allah. That they're not referred to as Ansar Allah. They're like made to look like a tribal faction, you know, Houthi. Interesting too that like the words strike and struck are used repeatedly to describe the US behavior, but attack is used to describe the Yemeni. That was really interesting that like it was military propaganda to keep using the word strike and everything. And then the narrative, of course, is like in retaliation, like the US is doing this in retaliation for the 3 deaths, but there's no starting point of like what the US has been doing to Yemen for 2 decades. So that was just some of the things that came up in our group.
Yeah, and I think our group was similar too. We talked about how this is all these comments in the media are all official statements, and there's no context and no historical perspective given of what's going on and how and it's always presented, like you say, Sarah, as the U.S. is always on the victim of someone else who's irrationally acting out, and their opinion is not legitimate. And I think a lot of that in what we were talking about is the role of the media in shaping an opinion in the American public is a large goal of all of this propaganda. There might be other things too that people spoke to, but I think that was part of it.
One of the things that came up in our group is that the article doesn't address the starting point for the reason for this missile strikes in the Red Sea, which is that they will stop the missile strikes when the genocide in Gaza stops, and that they actually did stop bombing during the pause of fighting in Gaza. And so that's like completely obliterated.
Yeah, something that I want to point out that I got only reading from different articles is it's talking about this. There's a UK, Australia, Bahrain, Canada, Denmark, Netherlands, New Zealand coalition that is attacking Ansar Allah. That coalition only includes Bahrain. They invited every other country they could that they are friendly with in the Middle East, and only Bahrain agreed to it, because all the other countries are like, no, we're not fucking working with you. What the fuck? They don't mention that tidbit in this article either. They're like, oh, it's the international coalition is attacking Ansar Allah.
I also thought it was interesting the part where they're talking about the illegal attacks against the vessels, whatever, and how y'all were saying that it's essentially functioning as a blockade, you know, and so they conveniently choose to use that language of like illegality coming from the US when we're blockading the shit out of Cuba, you know, and like not saying anything about the blockade against Gaza and things like that. And so just the convenient choosing of when to get indignant about a blockade.
Yeah, yeah, there's so much happening in the chat that was said that, yeah, it's like, someone mentioned like the complete divorcing of any of this from like historical and even present context. I think in one sentence, maybe two, but it's like, this is in response to the Houthi attacks that started in October since the Israel-Hamas war. And as someone earlier mentioned, I think it's just worth repeating, like, this is a very specific thing that is happening due to a very specific stimulus, which is a horrific genocide. And I think Pia mentioned, like, they have stated multiple times that this will stop as soon as that stops. But that's like, yeah, there's nothing of that here. Any other kind of things that were raised, or like we said, questions? Like we had trouble finding military base or countries that didn't have U.S. military bases. Were there other questions that were kind of hard to answer but feel like they'd be worth a shout out?
Not necessarily a question, but an offering. Our group mentioned how we in the US just have so much power, more than we know. We feel so helpless. And just one of the things, like in Albuquerque, being so close to the bases, I mentioned in my group that like every time one of those military flights goes over, putting out a little prayer. I just feel like the power of prayer is really powerful, especially collective prayer. And so just inviting that at the very least, it calms my own heart rather than like getting in anger and fear and frustration at the warplanes going who knows where, but offering, may all beings around you be safe and protected. And yeah, just whatever prayer comes through, just remembering our own power.
Yeah, I think, and in addition to that, you can also join an organization like Red Ant Collective, Sammy Dune, the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition, or any of the others that regularly do work to support Palestine and to oppose war. There's also organizations in Taos. Lizzie and Brian are part of that one. And there's also a research group you can message the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition about if you want to get involved. Research is weapons that the US sends to other people to use, and where they're manufactured and stuff. Emma, I've seen you had your hand raised. You want to talk?
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that was brought up in our group is that we focused on paragraphs 6 and 7, I believe, of the article that we had, which was the NPR article. But it's intentional that they're not getting comments from these groups and they're only getting comments from the representatives, because like, you know, Hamas and the other groups, like I'm sure they've reached out to them with press contacts for interviews if they wanted to interview them. Just as like someone with journalistic training, I know that if you're talking about somebody, you are supposed to get a quote from that person or a comment or response from that person. And so like it's the same for organizations. Like you really aren't supposed to publish something without corroborating that information and like getting a response. So I just think it's very clear, you know, that they're not following that journalistic ethic for this situation specifically. And someone in our group called it journalistic malpractice, which I thought was a really good way of putting it.
Thank you, Emma. Lizzie and Brian?
Yeah, I think not like so much about the article's framing, but like thinking about like what did get a US response. And obviously that response was like brutal and violent and repressive. But it's like once Ansar like got in the way of like commercial trade and the bottom line of the imperialists and the capitalists, suddenly it was like real quick. Everyone knew about the Bab el Mandeb Straits and And the United States like immediately responded, and obviously that response was to like ignore the root causes, at least in the media, and like pretend that like this has nothing to do with Palestine, and just like totally repress those forces. But I think like thinking about it here, like organizing here, it's like that these like moral appeals to our elected officials, like to find a conscience and to like stop this arming of genocide is like not helpful, and it's not something that like they give a shit about and like will not respond to. And in fact, they'll like it, I mean, like they'll invite us to go and speak and be like, please, please do this in their houses, like in their rotundra. We were there yesterday speaking in the rotundra, like sanctioned by the state. And that's not going to change anything. Like it won't get a response from the state. And so it's like, how do we actually like um organize effectively in a way that like, and I think that is to interrupt distribution and production, and that could look like organizing our workplaces, organizing tenants, and actually like bringing about a militant movement that demands the end to this genocide and the genocides here as well.
Thank you for that. Renee.
Yeah, just to add to the comments about media and how things are portrayed. Since this war started on October 7th, 85 Gazan journalists have been killed. And I guess people generally think of CNN as sort of a liberal media. They're embedded in the Israeli IDF, and everything they put out has to be approved by the government of Israel. Just to, know that we're not always getting what news we should be. That's all.
Yeah, it's interesting being in a country that often talks about, we'll hear about the DPRK, what we call North Korea, right, as being the most propagandized country in the world. When like you ask people around the world, and they're like, "Oh, the most propagandized country in the world is the United States," is a common answer, right? Anything else? I think we've taken a lot of y'all's time, and we have just a couple things to share before we close. But anything else that was coming up? This has been a really awesome discussion. I'm grateful to be here with y'all.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one more thing.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, thank you. Just that Hezbollah and Ansar Allah, they work independent of Iran. They're not proxies of Iran. Iran does not direct them on what to bomb and what to do. They might get some funding of military equipment from Iran, but they don't tell their Ansar or the Houthis what to do. They work independently. And by trying to make them all seem one entity, it's going to be easier to foment a war against Iran one of these days.
Yeah, that's an incredible point. Eunice, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was gonna just add to that, like it's just so ridiculous, like that article, like I ran back, like the whole concept of like the bogeyman, and to kind of like rile up that sort of vague fear with no context of saying. And like the thing is too, is like it's quite likely true that there are, when they say I ran back, that there's money moving around, like just like Gaddafi like generously gave to like lots of like movements or whatever, like militia, but and then at the same time, like no one speaks to all the secretive US backed paramilitias that they support and that they're always like switching sides to, so that sort of like enormous hypocrisy. And one of the questions that like we were speaking to in our group, it was like I think one of the first question that y'all had, and sort of like, oh, like if your government didn't agree with like another country's government, like what would you do? And I feel like that's relevant in that sort of like what someone was just saying about like speaking and the roundhouse like the sort of like the level of like organization slash education slash like community building that I feel like needs to happen. So it's like you can even talk to your neighbor, as dicey as that might feel, you know what I mean, about these things where it becomes more commonplace, like just as commonplace as it can be to just throw around being like, these are Iranian backed, blah, blah, blah. Like, I feel like we should be able to have commonplace, like that's the level of commonplace conversation that needs to be able to happen, you know, like in that way. So it's not this, yeah, just totally like propagandized mentality towards things. I'll stop there because I'll just start rambling and ranting.
I was just gonna say, speaking of like Iran, Pia, and how a lot of this is proxy wars, and that Yemen has been like really caught in the middle, and especially if around, you know, the year 2000 when Iran did invade Kuwait, and the US got together like all of its friends. It was Canada, Britain, France, Australia, you know, all of the others. And they said, you know, we're going to invade Kuwait and we're doing interventionalism at whatever cost. And there was like United Nations Security Council, and Yemen was in that. And everyone voted, and there was two countries that were against United States interventionalism, and it was Yemen and it was Cuba, and I think China abstained. And so Yemen and Cuba both said no, and they were worried, especially about the US interventionalism part. And Cuba also said the fact that United States is using the words, we will do whatever necessary to invade this country. And I think those are obviously big red flags. And as soon as Yemen said that they oppose US interventionalism, that is when this I think it's a terrorism of starving people and blocking off all medication. We know almost 1 million children have died, if not more, have been starved to death with sanctions, which are not nonviolent. And so seeing about how Yemen has been put in this position of being brutalized by US proxy wars, not only because of this anti-communist proxy war before, but also this Iran proxy war and this using Saudi Arabia again. There's so many different pieces. So I just really wanted to lift that up. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for mentioning that. And one thing going off that too is when Yemen voted against that, that was actually kind of a big turning point to entrench Saleh in his position, because there was a lot of money coming in from there's like 1 million Yemenis working in Saudi Arabia at the time, and those remittances were paying for a lot of development and bringing a lot of money into Yemen. When Yemen voted like that, no, not 1 million, 800,000. Saudi Arabia kicked all of them out, tried to kick all of them out, which stopped a lot of those remittances coming back in, and made the development of Yemen and services and whatever depend a lot more on the central government, which was getting oil money and aid money and stuff. And so that allowed Saleh to kind of help entrench his control in the country because of that vote, by the way.
Go ahead, Saida.
Thank you. I just wanted to lift up something slightly different. One thing I appreciate about Yemeni people is their sense of humor. So like they're known for political satire, and there's even parts of Yemen called like factories for jokes. But if you've watched them take over the ships, they use a lot of humor. They dance, they laugh. They took one Israeli ship and put a wedding on it. They had a wedding party on it. So I just want to lift up some cultural like ways that they organize. But I think it's interesting that Yemeni people really enjoy humor, and despite like the famine, despite being bombed like for a century. And so I don't know, I'll put a link in the video of just them dancing on the ships and like playing music, but they actually took one over and made a wedding, and they're just totally in a way like pushing back. And when the bombing started most recently, they said, well, at least Palestine's not the only one bombed. Like they were making a joke out of that. Like, well, hey, now we're in solidarity. I'm amazed by their humor.
Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. Go ahead, Chris.
I think it's really important that we do take care of ourselves, that we use humor, connection, dance, and resilience. This work can be very, very draining and heartbreaking over and over. And just to encourage everyone to get support, have people you can cry and rant with, to not just like be talking heads and activists to the point that it burns us out. To just, I really want to encourage everyone to take really good care of yourselves and remember humor and the arts and ways to connect that recharge us, as well as doing this hard work. That's it.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Chris. Yeah, and thanks also for sharing that, Saida. That laughter was really nice. And some of their music videos, I think Isabel, someone mentioned a lot earlier, like some of their music videos are also kind of hilarious. Yeah. Cool. Well, this has been a really lovely discussion. Go ahead, Zaina.
I have a question for the two speakers who did a lot of research. So I had read something that there seems to be like sort of a a messaging problem that the United States is having, where people are really so in support of Yemen, and so I read that like, oh well, if you knew about Yemen, like you wouldn't be in support of them. Like I've read that like the protests, videos of their protests have been huge, and people have like poked holes in that, saying like, well, they're only that huge because like Yemen is a poor country, and the Houthis are an oppressive authoritarian government, and so like they control the resources in Yemen and they control food, and so they promise people certain things like food if you attend the protest. So in your research, can you speak to any of that, either like refute it, anything like that?
I haven't heard of that coming from the Ansar Allah movement. I haven't heard them doing anything like that. I have heard that there is somewhat of like a federalist kind of like regime, so like all the parts are not like super centrally governed. I wouldn't be surprised if the US dug up some fucking like place in the middle of nowhere where somebody was like, I'll pay you $5 if you come to this protest, and they're like, it's a government-wide thing, they're doing it everywhere, and it's probably bullshit. I will also say that the Saleh regime before them, it didn't do that to get people to show up to protest, but the system that it used to govern is called a patronage system. So like you need to be loyal to Saleh, and that's how your region and your like your area gets resources, gets services and stuff like that. So and that was like a kind of a Saudi backed, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, Savannah, and I got to tell you that I have no idea. I'm sorry. It was hard to find, yeah, kind of balanced coverage on that kind of subject. And curious if anyone happens to have any other insights, and if not, we'll move towards closing. Yeah, Luna's making a point in the chat that there are similar claims made about Cuba and their state-mandated protests, and I think just always worth trying to flag a lot of claims made by the US government or even media apparatuses we see about other countries as like, is that real though? Or like, yeah, the degree to which that's real.
I also will say that the way that we understand our countries and like and governance models in particular are just like very, very different than like how other countries would in context would understand how governance should happen. So for example, in Cuba, you see like massive protests, for example, for Palestine, where like the president of Cuba was there, and like every year there's massive like revolutionary protests, and people say, okay, well, they're forced to do that. And it's like, yes, part of like they have national holidays where like everyone is expected to go and like be part of protests, but we cannot fathom in our context having our job like, you know, having a national holiday where we are encouraged to go and like be part of something that's part of our national history that we're actually proud of, where like they actually can fathom that, and that is their reality. So when we say, okay, when the propaganda is like they're being forced to do this, or like they're being paid to do this, or like they're just like have to do this or they're going to lose their jobs, it's not like the same way that would happen here, because we live in like extreme late stage capitalism. There it's like part of the culture is that you are expected to, like, if you are revolutionary, which a lot of people are, you're expected to engage in these kinds of protests and actions. And I think that's just something that like we can't really fathom because we have such a different context.
Can I just like add to that too, that I feel like that part of that propaganda like panders to that very American or Western, like as if there aren't other ways of doing things. So it's to me like just a larger way of saying might be like cultural differences, you know, or social differences that even like in the West, you know, to be, for many reasons, religion is like looked down upon. And I'm not Christian, but at the same time, there's sort of like a lack of respect for other spiritual understandings and cultural like context, you know, where that sort of complexity or nuance is just kind of erased. And it's sort of like democracy or the highway.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for uplifting that, Luna and Eunice. And thank you all for being brave. We're in like a group of like at most like it was like between 60 and 70 people, and people are coming off mute and talking in a really big group, which for me is really scary. So yeah. Let's can we go to the next slide, Nico? The sad Frito pie slide that won't happen today. Cool. So thank you again. We're really grateful that everyone was here today and contributing to a discussion that we hopefully all learned from, that we hopefully all can take things to our different contexts and educate our community. Like I mentioned earlier, a really good way to do this is join an organization. If you have not done that, that's a really good way to continue these types of conversations and translate that into actions that we can take as a group. We're like 40 people that are talking a lot of amazing things about anti-imperialism and being anti-war and finding the joy in that type of resistance. So let's do that together. Let's do this more. We will continue this series. As Nico mentioned at the beginning, the next installment is going to be focused on Hamas on February 25th at 2 p.m. We hope to do hybrid, so we hope to be at the place that we were going to be today, the Friends Meeting House at Bellama and 5th Street. I can't remember the address off the top of my head. If you can join, please do. And whether you can or cannot, please share this amongst your friends and family and community so that other people can kind of participate in this discussion. And as Nico also mentioned, we'll have a third day focusing on Hezbollah, and we're also sort of dreaming up maybe doing one on Syria and doing one on Iran. And Nico mentions in the chat that in person we are requiring masks, and there's actually a page in the packet kind of speaking to that and why we're asking folks to do that. Yeah, does anyone else have anything by way of closing? Dope. Enjoy the sunshine, y'all. Have a great day. Thank you so much.